Kira Blackwood leaned back in her dorm room chair, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest. The soft hum of the Galactic Academy of Cultural Exchange filled the air, a blend of alien voices and strange sounds from distant worlds. Despite the Academy's bustling energy, Kira's mind was focused on one thing: tomorrow's event. She glanced at the communication screen, replaying the message for what felt like the 100th time. Miss Blackwood, the voice of her alien professor, Zix-L, echoed from the screen. His voice, a high-pitched chirp, always made her stifle a laugh. Tomorrow is a very important day. Bring your pet to school day. As our sole human representative, your participation is crucial. It will foster understanding and promote harmony among all species at the Academy. Kira groaned softly, rubbing her temples. "You want me to bring what to school?" she had asked, barely keeping her disbelief in check when the announcement was first made. "Your pet, of course." Zix-L's voice had been filled with excitement. "We've done extensive research on Earth's domesticated animals, and we're looking forward to meeting whatever adorable creature you choose to bring. I'm sure it will fit in perfectly with the other students' companions." Kira snorted at the memory, her eyes drifting to the large, reinforced crate sitting in the corner of her room. She stared at it for a moment, biting her lip. Her pet wasn't exactly what Professor Zix-L might expect. It wasn't a small, harmless companion like the ones she had seen the other students parade around the Academy. "Well, this is going to be interesting," she muttered to herself, standing up to inspect the crate more closely. A low, rumbling growl vibrated through the air from inside the crate, causing her to chuckle softly. "Don't worry, Fluffy. Tomorrow's going to be a blast." The next day, the Galactic Academy's atrium was buzzing with excitement. Students of every species gathered, showing off their pets. Colorful creatures floated through the air, glowing with bioluminescence, while others scuttled across the floor, trailing behind their alien owners. Kira stood at the entrance, the leash in her hand taut as she struggled to keep her own pet under control. She took a deep breath and surveyed the scene before her. It was a spectacle of intergalactic peace and harmony, just as Professor Zix-L had envisioned. Furry, slimy, scaly, and glowing creatures chirped, squeaked, and trilled. Some pets defied gravity, hovering beside their owners, while others oozed along in puddles of iridescent slime. Professor Zix-L himself stood near the front, overseeing the event with an air of smug satisfaction. His tentacles twisted with pride as he gestured to the headmaster, Quick-Zax, a being made of shimmering, crystalline structures. "You see, Headmaster, it's exactly as I predicted," Zix-L said confidently. "A perfect display of interspecies cooperation and understanding. I have no doubt Miss Blackwood's pet will be equally charming." The headmaster's crystal body shimmered with intrigue. "Indeed, I am curious to see what kind of creature our human student has brought. I've heard Earth animals can be quite diverse." As if on cue, the heavy doors at the entrance slid open with a soft hiss, drawing the attention of every being in the room. Kira strode in, her face a mixture of determination and amusement, though her grip on the steel leash suggested she was barely holding something back. At the end of that leash, a massive shadow loomed, rolling softly. Professor Zix-L's tentacles froze in midair as his eyes widened in disbelief. His usually composed voice cracked as he whispered, "By the cosmic egg, is that?" Kira grinned and waved as she casually approached the group, her pet lumbering behind her. "Everyone, meet Fluffy," she said, voice dripping with irony. The students gasped in unison as Fluffy came into full view. A towering mass of muscle and fur, with gleaming eyes that shone like molten metal, Fluffy was unlike any other pet in the room. It resembled an earth wolf, if earth wolves were the size of a small hovercraft and had armored scales running down their backs. Its claws scraped the floor, leaving deep grooves in the metal surface. The creature let out a low growl, causing several students to instinctively take a step back, their pets retreating behind them. Kira gave the steel cable leash a light tug, and Fluffy obediently sat, though the ground seemed to shake beneath him. "Don't worry," Kira said with a wink. "He's friendly. Well, mostly." Professor Zixel, still recovering from shock, wrung his tentacles nervously. "Miss Blackwood, I believe there may have been some kind of misunderstanding. This creature, is that what humans consider a pet?" Kira raised an eyebrow and smirked. "Of course. On Earth, we call him a dire wolf. Fluffy here is a big softie, as long as you don't try to take his toys." Several alien students cautiously approached, curiosity overtaking their initial fear. One student, a being with iridescent skin and multiple arms, hesitated before asking, "What does it eat?" "Meat," Kira replied casually, patting Fluffy on the head. "Lots of it." Professor Zixel's tentacles twisted nervously. "Well, this is highly irregular, but I suppose it's in the spirit of interspecies understanding." Kira shot him a cheeky grin. "Don't worry, Professor. Fluffy's not going to eat anyone unless they give him a reason to." Despite the initial shock, the event continued. Kira watched as the alien students slowly warmed up to Fluffy, their initial fear giving way to fascination. A group of younglings dared each other to approach him, and one brave alien even reached out to touch his fur. Fluffy, surprisingly gentle, allowed the attention, his massive tail thumping on the floor. As the day went on, Fluffy's legend spread across the academy. The rumors started small, but soon the entire event turned into a display of awe and wonder at the human's pet. By the end of the day, Kira and Fluffy had become the stars of the show. Later that evening, as the atrium emptied and students returned to their quarters, Professor Zixel found himself standing beside Kira and Fluffy. The professor's tentacles wriggled with a mixture of awe and exhaustion. "Well, Miss Blackwood," he said, "I must admit, your pet is quite remarkable. Though I must also admit I was not prepared for such a large and intimidating creature." Kira chuckled, patting Fluffy one last time before they headed back to her dorm. "That's the thing about humans, Professor. We like to push boundaries." As they walked away, the massive dire wolf following at her heels, Kira couldn't help but grin. Interspecies harmony, maybe. But one thing was for sure, nobody at the Galactic Academy would ever forget Fluffy. Cultural clash and Fluffy's reputation grows. The day after the Bring Your Pet to School Day event, Kira's life at the Galactic Academy took on a strange new rhythm. Everywhere she went, curious glances followed her, and the whispers were constant. Some of the alien students stared in awe, while others gave her a wide berth as if her proximity alone might invite disaster. Kira didn't mind the attention. In fact, she found it amusing. After all, she had always known that humans were seen as somewhat unpredictable by many of the Academy's species. But now, with Fluffy at her side, she had taken that unpredictability to a whole new level. As she walked through the Academy's massive corridors, Fluffy padded beside her, his enormous paws making a dull thud with every step. He seemed unfazed by the attention, his eyes calmly scanning his surroundings. Occasionally, his nose would twitch as he caught an unfamiliar scent, but he remained relaxed, loyal and protective by Kira's side. By the time Kira reached her first class of the day, a gathering on intergalactic fauna studies, the tension in the air was palpable. Her classmates were already seated, and as she entered the room, they shifted in their seats nervously, many casting anxious glances at Fluffy. Even the professor, a tall, insectoid being with delicate, translucent wings, hesitated before beginning the lecture. "Ah, Miss Blackwood, welcome," the professor chirped, their antennae twitching in what Kira assumed was anxiety. "I see you've brought your companion with you again." Kira smiled politely and gestured to the back of the classroom. "Is it all right if Fluffy just hangs out here? He won't disturb the class." The professor hesitated for a moment, but then nodded quickly. "Ah, yes, of course. As long as he remains calm, I see no problem with his presence." Kira led Fluffy to a spot in the corner of the room, where he promptly lay down, his massive frame curling into what could only be described as an attempt to look less intimidating. It wasn't very effective. As the lecture continued, Kira couldn't help but notice the occasional glances from her classmates. Some students looked fascinated, while others kept a nervous distance, as if Fluffy might suddenly spring into action. Midway through the lecture, one of her classmates, a four-eyed alien with shimmering, jewel-like scales, cautiously raised a hand. The professor paused, nodding for the student to speak. "Professor," the student began, their voice trembling slightly, "could we perhaps discuss the differences between Earth's apex predators and other predators from galactic species?" The professor blinked their compound eyes, clearly caught off guard by the question. Yes, I suppose we could. Apex predators from Earth are a fascinating topic." The student turned their head slightly, casting a wary glance at Fluffy before continuing. "Because our Miss Blackwood seems to have one sitting in our classroom." A ripple of nervous laughter spread through the room, but Kira simply rolled her eyes, amused. She raised a hand to chime in, and the professor nodded toward her. "To clarify," Kira said, leaning forward slightly in her seat, "Fluffy isn't exactly an apex predator on Earth. He's a dire wolf, which means he's part of an ancient species that went extinct a long time ago. With some genetic manipulation, humans were able to bring them back. But he's more of a protector than a predator. He's trained to defend, not hunt." The room fell silent, and the professor seemed to consider Kira's explanation carefully. "Ah, I see," the professor said, wings fluttering in thought. "A fascinating example of how Earth's species have been revived through advanced genetic techniques. However, he still exhibits predatory traits, does he not?" Kira shrugged, glancing over at Fluffy, who was now dozing peacefully in the corner. "Sure, but only if there's a threat. Otherwise, he's like a really big, really protective dog." The professor nodded slowly, the tension in the room easing slightly. "Thank you for the clarification, Miss Blackwood. Let's continue with our discussion on apex predators." As the class went on, Kira's thoughts drifted back to Earth. She had always loved how adaptable humans were. Whether it was reviving extinct animals or thriving in extreme environments, humanity had a knack for bending the rules of nature. That adaptability was what had brought her to the Galactic Academy in the first place. After class, as Kira and Fluffy made their way through the halls, a group of students caught up to her. Among them was a young alien with pale, lavender skin and wide, curious eyes. Kira recognized her as Yilara, one of the more studious members of the Academy. "Hey, Kira," Yilara called, her voice filled with excitement. "Can I ask you something about Fluffy?" Kira turned with a friendly smile. "Sure, what's up?" Yilara glanced down at Fluffy, who was lazily padding beside Kira, his eyes half closed in contentment. "So, is he really not dangerous? I've read about Earth's predatory species, and it just seems like he could do a lot of damage if he wanted to." Kira knelt down to scratch Fluffy behind the ears, his tail thumping gently against the floor. "Fluffy's dangerous, yeah," she admitted with a shrug. "But only if there's a reason to be. He's trained to protect, not attack. That's the thing about humans and our pets. We bond with them, train them, and they become part of our family. It's not just about power, it's about trust." Yilara nodded thoughtfully, her eyes flicking back to Fluffy. "I think that's what's so fascinating about humans. You take creatures that could be dangerous and turn them into something different, something better." Kira grinned. "Yeah, we have a habit of doing that. It's kind of what humans do best." As the group walked with Kira and Fluffy, more students joined in, their curiosity about Earth's creatures growing. Kira found herself answering questions about Earth's wildlife, from domestic pets like cats and dogs to the more exotic, long-extinct animals that humanity had brought back through cloning and genetic engineering. But it wasn't just about the animals. The conversations shifted to human culture, technology, and philosophy. Kira explained how humanity's history of survival, adaptation, and innovation had shaped their approach to the galaxy. The students, who had once viewed humans as unpredictable, began to see them as something more, something inspiring. Over the next few days, Fluffy became a fixture at the academy. His size and presence was still intimidating, but the students started to see beyond that. Fluffy was more than just a big, powerful creature. He was a reflection of the human spirit, fierce, protective, but ultimately loyal and kind. As Kira sat in the academy's central courtyard one afternoon, watching Fluffy chase after a robotic ball she had brought from Earth, she felt a sense of pride. Humans had always been underestimated, often seen as too emotional or too unpredictable. But here, at the Galactic Academy, Kira and Fluffy were showing the galaxy what humanity was truly capable of. It wasn't just about strength or power, it was about heart. The Galactic Council takes notice. As Kira and Fluffy continued to navigate life at the Galactic Academy, word of the human and her massive companion spread far beyond the campus. News of Fluffy's imposing presence and Kira's unflinching confidence began to filter through to the upper echelons of the Galactic Council, where officials were always on the lookout for signs of potential threats or disruptions. Unbeknownst to Kira, one particular council member, Ambassador Sornak of the Freskian race, had taken a special interest in the human phenomenon. Sornak, a cautious and pragmatic official, had always been wary of humans. He had read extensively on their history, noting their tendency to rise to dominance in whatever environment they found themselves. From their survival on their home planet, often called the Deathworld by other species, to their sudden emergence as a significant galactic power, humans were a species that intrigued and unsettled him. Sornak decided it was time to pay a visit to the Galactic Academy and witness this human and her so-called pet firsthand. If rumors were to be believed, the human ability to domesticate even the fiercest creatures might hold far-reaching implications for galactic diplomacy and security. A few days later, Kira sat in the Academy's library, engrossed in her studies. Fluffy lay sprawled on the floor beside her, occasionally lifting his head to glance around the quiet room before resuming his nap. Kira was just finishing a paper on xenobiology when a faint hum of activity reached her ears. She looked up to see several of her classmates gathered near the entrance, murmuring among themselves in hushed tones. Curious, Kira stood and wandered over to the group, Fluffy lumbering to his feet to follow her. As she approached, one of her friends, an alien named Drix with cobalt blue skin and shimmering eyes, turned to her with an excited expression. "Kira, did you hear?" Drix asked, his voice buzzing with excitement. "An ambassador from the Galactic Council is here. They're saying he came specifically to meet you, and Fluffy." Kira's brows furrowed in confusion. "An ambassador? Why would they want to meet me?" Drix shrugged, his antennae twitching slightly. "Apparently, they're interested in humans and how we handle dangerous creatures. You know, with all the stories about Fluffy." Kira chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I didn't realize a big, fluffy dog could cause such a stir." But beneath her light-hearted demeanor, Kira felt a twinge of apprehension. The Galactic Council was a powerful governing body, overseeing relations between countless species across the galaxy. If they were interested in her, it likely meant they were interested in humanity as a whole, and that could mean anything from diplomatic talks to security concerns. Before Kira could dwell on it further, a voice called out from behind her, "Miss Blackwood." She turned to see a tall, imposing figure standing at the entrance to the library. Ambassador Sornak was a Freskian, his elongated limbs covered in a shimmering chitinous exoskeleton. His eyes, a deep, inky black, fixed on Kira with an intensity that made her pause. Two smaller Freskian aides flanked him, their posture rigid and formal. Kira straightened, her mind racing as she tried to remember the proper diplomatic protocols. "Yes, I'm Kira Blackwood," she replied, offering a polite nod. "And this is Fluffy." Sornak's gaze shifted to Fluffy, who sat calmly beside Kira, his eyes half closed but alert. The ambassador took a cautious step closer, his movements slow and deliberate. Kira could sense the tension in the air, the careful way the ambassador regarded the massive dire wolf. "I have heard much about you, Miss Blackwood," Sornak said, his voice smooth and measured. "And about your companion. It is said that humans have a unique relationship with dangerous creatures, a relationship built on trust and cooperation rather than dominance." Kira nodded, unsure where the conversation was heading. "That's true. Fluffy's not just a pet. He's a partner. We take care of each other." Sornak's dark eyes seemed to glimmer with curiosity. "Fascinating. Your species has always been one of intrigue to the Council. Despite your relatively short time in the galactic community, humans have made remarkable strides, often through unconventional means. Tell me, Miss Blackwood, do you believe this relationship you share with Fluffy is indicative of how humans approach challenges in general?" Kira hesitated for a moment, considering the question. "I think so," she said slowly. "Humans have always found ways to adapt, even when the odds are against us. Whether it's surviving in hostile environments or learning to coexist with creatures like Fluffy, we don't just fight our way through challenges. We try to understand them, to work with them." Solnak studied her for a long moment before nodding thoughtfully. "That is an admirable philosophy. It is no wonder that humans have garnered both admiration and apprehension from the galactic community." The ambassador turned his attention back to Fluffy, who had remained quiet and still throughout the exchange. "This creature," Solnak continued, his voice lowering slightly, "represents more than just a pet, does he not? He is a symbol of your species' ability to tame the untamable, to bend the natural order to your will." Kira frowned, feeling a slight edge to the ambassador's words. "It's not about bending anything to our will," she said, her tone firm. "It's about building connections. Fluffy trusts me because I've earned that trust. It's the same way humans approach diplomacy or science. We don't force things, we find ways to work together." Solnak's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing. Instead, he gestured to one of his aides, who stepped forward with a sleek data pad. "The Council has been closely monitoring humanity's progress," Solnak said, his voice taking on a more formal tone. "Your species is on the verge of becoming a significant player in galactic affairs. With that comes great responsibility and scrutiny. The way you handle challenges, both small and large, will determine your place in the galactic order." Kira crossed her arms, her mind racing. This meeting wasn't just about Fluffy. It was about humanity's future, about how they were perceived by the rest of the galaxy. She knew that one wrong move could have far-reaching consequences. "I understand," Kira said, her voice steady. "But I think you'll find that humans are more than capable of handling whatever challenges come our way." Solnak inclined his head slightly, his expression inscrutable. "I hope you are right, Miss Blackwood. The galaxy is watching." With that, the ambassador turned and began to walk away, his aides following closely behind. Kira watched them go, her mind still reeling from the encounter. As soon as they were out of sight, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Fluffy, sensing her tension, nudged her hand gently with his nose. She smiled down at him, grateful for his silent support. "Well, Fluff," she said with a wry grin, "looks like we've caught the attention of some pretty important people." Fluffy huffed softly in response, as if to say, "No big deal." But Kira knew better. This was just the beginning. The Galactic Council's interest in humanity, and in her, was only going to grow. And with that attention came challenges she hadn't even begun to imagine. Galactic politics and new challenges. The days following Ambassador Sornak's visit were anything but calm. Kira had hoped that the encounter would be a fleeting moment of curiosity from the Galactic Council, but it soon became clear that the attention on her, and humanity, was far from over. Rumors began to circulate through the Academy. Whispers about humans, their potential threat, and the Council's interest in them filled the halls. Kira tried her best to ignore the gossip, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her every move was being watched. One afternoon, as Kira was leaving her xenobiology class, a familiar voice called out to her. "Kira, wait up." She turned to see Professor Lauren, the head of xenobiology and one of the few faculty members Kira truly respected. The professor was a member of the Valuri species, with an elongated face, deep green skin, and large expressive eyes that often betrayed his kind and curious nature. "Kira, I need to speak with you," Professor Lauren said, his voice tinged with urgency. "There's something you need to know about the Council's interest in you." Kira's heart sank. She had been trying to avoid thinking too much about the Council's attention, but it seemed the issue wasn't going away. "What's going on, Professor?" Kira asked, keeping her tone as casual as possible. Lauren glanced around, ensuring no one was listening, before speaking in a lower voice. "The Council has initiated an inquiry into humanity's role in galactic politics. They're not just curious about your relationship with Fluffy, they're assessing the entire human race." Kira blinked, taken aback. "An inquiry? What does that mean?" "It means they're gathering data, observing your actions, and evaluating whether humans pose a potential threat or if you're an asset to the galaxy. You've made quite an impression, Kira, especially with Fluffy by your side." Kira swallowed hard. This wasn't just about her studies or her unusual pet. The Council was trying to decide whether humans were dangerous. Professor Lauren continued, his expression serious. "I've been contacted by several Council representatives, asking about your behavior, your academic performance, and your relationship with Fluffy. They're particularly intrigued by how humans manage to forge bonds with creatures that other species would deem uncontrollable." Kira frowned. "But Fluffy's not uncontrollable. He's loyal, and we trust each other. That's all it is." Lauren nodded. "I understand that, and so do your friends. But the Council sees things differently. They view power and control through the lens of dominance. The fact that Fluffy chooses to follow you, that he obeys you without coercion, makes them uneasy. They fear that humans may have a hidden capability to influence and control other species." Kira clenched her fists at her sides. "That's ridiculous. We're not trying to control anyone." "I know that," Lauren said, his voice gentle but firm. "But this is about perception. And right now, the perception of humans is shifting." Kira exhaled slowly, her mind racing. She had never asked for this kind of attention. All she wanted was to get through the academy, learn as much as she could, and maybe prove that humans were just as capable as any other species in the galaxy. But now it seemed she was at the center of a much larger issue, one that could affect the future of humanity's place in the galaxy. "Is there anything I can do to stop this?" Kira asked, her voice quieter than before. Lauren gave her a sympathetic look. "The best thing you can do is continue being yourself. Show them that humans aren't a threat, and, if possible, avoid drawing more attention to yourself, though I know that may be difficult with Fluffy at your side." Kira nodded, though doubt gnawed at her. It felt like an impossible task. How was she supposed to convince the entire Galactic Council that humanity wasn't dangerous, especially when they were already on edge? "Thank you, Professor," Kira said, trying to muster a smile. "I'll do my best." Lauren placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I know you will, Kira. You've already proven yourself to be exceptional, and I have no doubt you'll rise to the occasion." With that, the professor walked away, leaving Kira standing in the corridor, her mind swirling with uncertainty. That evening, Kira sat in her dorm room, staring out the window at the sprawling city beyond the academy walls. Fluffy lay at her feet, his massive head resting on his paws. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the academy's central systems and the distant sounds of city life. Kira absent-mindedly ran her fingers through Fluffy's fur, her thoughts elsewhere. She had always known that being human in a galaxy filled with advanced older species came with challenges, but this was something she hadn't anticipated. Suddenly, Fluffy's ears perked up, and he lifted his head, a low growl rumbling from his throat. Kira snapped out of her reverie, her heart skipping a beat. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, her eyes scanning the room. A soft knock on the door broke the silence, and Kira stood, her hand instinctively resting on Fluffy's back. She approached the door cautiously and opened it just enough to peer through the gap. Standing outside was a tall figure in a dark, formal uniform. Kira recognized the insignia on his chest. It was the mark of the Galactic Council. "Miss Blackwood," the official asked, his voice calm and authoritative. Kira nodded, opening the door slightly wider. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you?" The official straightened, his expression unreadable. "You've been summoned to a meeting with the Galactic Council. Tomorrow, at 900 hours, we request your attendance." Kira's heart sank. A meeting with the council? This was escalating faster than she'd expected. "Of course," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I'll be there." The official nodded curtly before turning and walking away, leaving Kira standing in the doorway, her mind reeling. She closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding in her chest. Tomorrow, she would face the Galactic Council. Tomorrow, the future of humanity might very well be decided. Fluffy nudged her leg gently, sensing her unease. Kira knelt down beside him, resting her forehead against his thick fur. "We'll be okay, Fluff," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it. But one thing was certain: whatever came next, Kira and Fluffy would face it together. Facing the council. The morning of the meeting with the Galactic Council arrived all too quickly. Kira barely slept, her mind replaying the events of the past few days on an endless loop. She had dressed in the most formal attire she owned, a simple but well-tailored outfit that, she hoped, would help her make a good impression. But no matter how she tried to calm herself, her nerves buzzed with anxiety. Fluffy sensed her tension, staying close to her side as they walked through the grand halls of the academy toward the council's chamber. His massive form seemed to provide a sense of grounding, and Kira found herself absent-mindedly resting her hand on his fur for comfort. The council's chamber was an imposing structure, a towering building made of gleaming metal and glass, nestled at the heart of the city. As Kira approached, she could see representatives from various species entering the building. Tall, elegant forms, some humanoid, others with alien shapes and appendages she could hardly describe. All of them looked more at ease than she felt. When Kira reached the entrance, she was greeted by a stern-faced aide, dressed in the same dark uniform as the official who had summoned her the previous night. "Miss Blackwood?" the aide asked, eyeing Fluffy with a raised eyebrow. "Yes," Kira replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Follow me, please," the aide said, turning and leading her through a series of corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly. As they walked, Kira's thoughts raced. What would the council ask her? How could she possibly represent all of humanity in a single meeting? The weight of it all felt suffocating, and she struggled to keep her emotions in check. Finally, they reached a set of grand double doors. The aide turned to Kira, nodding once before pushing the doors open. Inside, the chamber was vast, its domed ceiling stretching high above, with windows that offered a panoramic view of the city below. The room was filled with representatives from every species in the Galactic Council, seated in tiered rows that surrounded a central platform. At the head of the chamber sat the Council's leaders, an assembly of the most influential beings in the galaxy. Kira felt a wave of apprehension wash over her as all eyes turned to her and Fluffy. "Miss Blackwood," a voice boomed from the front of the chamber. It was a deep, resonant voice belonging to one of the senior council members, a towering, four-armed creature with blue-green skin and glowing eyes. "Step forward." Kira took a deep breath and walked toward the center of the platform, with Fluffy padding silently beside her. She stood tall, determined not to let her fear show. "You have been brought here to discuss the matter of your bond with the creature known as Fluffy, as well as the implications this bond may have for humanity's place in the galaxy," the council member said, his eyes fixed on her. Kira swallowed but nodded. "I understand." Another council member, a sharp-featured, insectoid being, leaned forward. "We have reviewed reports of your interaction with this creature, An entity that, by all accounts, should not be tamed, yet follows you willingly. How do you explain this? Kira glanced down at Fluffy, who was sitting calmly at her side, his eyes scanning the room. She took a deep breath before responding. I can't claim to understand all the reasons why Fluffy chooses to stay with me, Kira began, her voice steady despite her nerves. But I know that our bond isn't based on control or dominance. It's built on trust, mutual respect, and care. Fluffy isn't my servant, he's my companion. A murmur spread through the chamber at her words, and Kira could feel the weight of the council's scrutiny. You speak of trust, another council member, this one a member of the reptilian Threkan species, said with a hiss. But how can the council be certain that humanity will not use this so-called trust to manipulate other species, or even to exert control over dangerous creatures like this one? Kira clenched her fists, her frustration bubbling to the surface. Because that's not what humans do, she said, her voice firm. We don't seek to dominate others. If anything, we value cooperation and understanding. I didn't force Fluffy to stay with me, he chose it. And I believe that's what makes our bond so strong. The reptilian council member narrowed his eyes, clearly unconvinced. But before he could respond, Ambassador Sornak, the very same Yulani who had visited Kira earlier, stood up from his seat in the front row. If I may, Sornak said, his voice smooth and authoritative. Miss Blackwood speaks the truth. I have observed her and her companion firsthand. Their bond is genuine, and it poses no threat to the safety of the galaxy. Kira felt a surge of relief at Sornak's words, though she knew the battle was far from over. Another voice, this one belonging to a delicate, avian-like creature, spoke up. But what of humanity as a whole? Are we to believe that all humans share this same respect for other species, for dangerous creatures? Kira's heart pounded in her chest. This was the moment she had feared. She wasn't just representing herself, she was representing all of humanity. I can't speak for every human, Kira admitted, her voice quieter but resolute. But I can tell you that humanity has learned a lot from our history, from our mistakes. We understand the importance of cooperation and empathy. We know that power doesn't come from domination. It comes from understanding, from building relationships. She paused, glancing around the chamber at the sea of avian faces watching her. Humans may not be perfect, but we have a lot to offer the galaxy. We can work together, we can learn from each other. And if you give us a chance, I believe we can prove that we're not a threat. The chamber fell silent. Kira could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the decision that hung over the room. She had said everything she could. Now, it was up to the council. After what felt like an eternity, the senior council member spoke once more. We will deliberate on this matter and come to a decision, he said, his voice measured. You are dismissed, Miss Blackwood. You will be informed of the council's verdict in due time. Kira nodded, relief and anxiety swirling inside her. She had done it, she had faced the council, but the outcome was still uncertain. As she and Fluffy turned to leave the chamber, Kira couldn't help but feel a sense of both accomplishment and dread. Whatever the council decided, it would have far-reaching consequences for humanity's place in the galaxy. Outside the chamber, Kira took a deep breath of the cool, crisp air. She knelt beside Fluffy, wrapping her arms around his thick neck. We did it, boy, she whispered, though her voice trembled slightly. Now we just have to wait. Fluffy licked her cheek, his way of reassuring her. Whatever the future held, they would face it together.